following video contains heavy spoilers for the Five Nights at Freddy's movie and is not intended for children. Viewer discretion is advised.
What do they want?
They want to make her like them.
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome to Five Nights at Freddy's.
For those of you who've recently woken up from a coma, Five Nights at Freddy's is the brainchild of indie developer Scott Cawthon. What was initially meant as a man's last hurrah at game development quickly exploded upon its initial release in 2014, kickstarting both the YouTube jump scare and theory economies thanks to the game's simple but effective scares.
No! Fucking fuck!
And enough contradictory lore to drive a man to madness.
Oh look, here's a wall. Let me just dial in my phone number. Beep boop boop beep boop boop. What?
I've mentioned this before, but I was really into the FNAF games when I was a kid, so I remember back in 2015 when Warner Brothers first announced they'd be working with Scott to adapt what at the time was just a trilogy of games into a feature-length film. But the project quickly entered into a state of development hell, with the rights getting passed over to Blumhouse and production cycling through 3 different directors. Eventually, I just stopped following the franchise and just assumed the movie would never come out. But here we are, just under a decade later, and after all that time, was it worth the wait? Kind of? Back when I first started hearing rumblings that this movie was going to be coming out of stasis, I was worried at the direction they were going to take in regards to the plot. The FNAF lore has become a bit of a meme online for just how strange and convoluted it's gotten over the years, due to the fact it's constantly being added to and extended, with the quality varying wildly from edition to edition. My fear was that by trying to appeal to as much of the fan base as possible, the story would end up getting bogged down in the name of being completely game accurate on paper. Thankfully, the movie carved its own space in the canon similarly to what the Silver Eyes trilogy did back when they came out, which was the best and obvious choice in hindsight. The film is a loose adaptation of the plot of the first game, with some add-ons from the post-Hub Wanted era, placing us in the shoes of Mike Schmidt, who's offered the job of security guard at the titular pizzeria only to discover that the animatronics
get a bit quirky at night.
But rather than simply leaving it there and adapting the gameplay for 90 minutes, FNAF opts to put a strong emphasis on these new characters, their backstories and relationships. And I personally really like this. Mike and his sister Abby feel like realistic siblings, despite their relationship understandably being strained due to Mike's lingering trauma from witnessing their brother being kidnapped years prior. It provides not only a great motivation for Mike to keep returning to Freddy's night after night, but also gives the film its emotional core. They actually show a surprising amount of restraint when it comes to having the robots move. After the cold open, it's almost a full 30 minutes before we get so much of a hint as to them moving again. And now that I think about it, the main scene where the animatronics hunt people down takes place during the day, which is a fun play on the expectation that the danger stops once morning comes. Blumhouse decided to go the practical route, calling upon the Jim Henson Creature Workshop to use a mix of puppetry, suits, and genuine robotics to bring the gang to life, meaning Freddy Fazbear is technically a Muppet. This means the animatronics actually end up looking like animatronics rather than just guys in suits, which, though I didn't bring it up in my original video, was a pretty big problem with the Banana Splits, and Willy's Wonderland too now that I think about it. And that same effort clearly went into building the pizzeria itself, taking somewhere that until now was essentially just a series of panoramas and making it into a place that not only felt real, but true to the games. All that being said, I do have some criticisms. The pacing feels like it was somewhat restricted by the Five Nights format, meaning that for the majority of the front half, you're basically just watching Mike bumming around an office and sleeping a lot. I also felt like there were some plot points that could have been explored a bit more, particularly in regards to the big bad.
What the hell? Purple guy!
Now, I'd be willing to bet any fan worth their salt came in already knowing that Matthew Lillard's character, Steve Raglan, was actually going to turn out to be William Afton. But I can't help but feel like the movie takes this foreknowledge for granted. We get a small hint during his introduction that he's familiar with Mike, but aside from that, he just kind of shows up in the spring bonnie suit at the end with very little fanfare, which kind of made the whole thing fall flat to me. We do get some very interesting hints towards Afton's relationship with Vanessa, who, by the way, is his daughter now, but it felt more like something that was just thrown in to justify Vanessa's appearance. But granted, I do get the sense that this will play more of a role in the inevitable sequel. But even beyond that, the film has some pretty serious tone problems. The front half covers some pretty dense subject matter with things like post-traumatic stress, family law, and even, you could argue, self-harm with the way that Mike constantly forces himself to relive the kidnapping of his brother night after night. And all this is treated with the level of seriousness you'd expect. But once we start getting into the back half, some downright bizarre scenes and attempts at comedy keep popping up. Like this scene where everyone, animatronics included, build a pillow fort for Abby to play in. Now, I think I understand what they were going for. This isn't even the first time the animatronics had been adapted this way. Like, Random Encounters did basically the same gag back when the games were still new. It's not only a good way to subvert expectations, but also plays into the fact that these are children puppeting these animatronics around. It lulls the characters into a false sense of security and gives the audience a sense of horror and tragedy when they think about the implications.
And I know this is gonna sound crazy and not very scary, but it is scary if you think about the implications.
But when you compare it to something like an earlier scene where Mike beats a man within an inch of his life in front of his child, it becomes the metaphorical layers of beef and onions in the trifle. I wouldn't go as far as to say this makes the film bad, it's just a weird choice. And at least from what I can tell, the serious subjects it does try and tackle are handled fairly well and respectfully, unlike certain other horror movies. However, this does lead nicely into my only real criticism of the film, that being that despite labeling itself as a horror, I'd be hard-pressed to call any part of it scary. I've seen a sizable chunk of people online putting the movie's lack of scares down to the fact that it's rated PG-13, but to me, a movie's age rating has almost nothing to do with how scary it is. Just as an example, The Empty Child and Midnight, two of the most terrifying pieces of television anyone my age has ever seen, were both given PG ratings. Granted, Doctor Who is primarily a family show, so what about something that was overtly advertised as being horror? Well, have you ever heard of Ghostwatch?
The program you're about to watch is a unique live investigation of the supernatural. It contains material which some viewers may find to be disturbing.
This made-for-TV movie was outright banned for a while following its first airing in 1992 due to an influx of complaints at it being too scary. It's also one of the 3 horror movies that have actually had a lingering impact on me after I've watched them. And it was rated 12A, which is the British equivalent of PG-13. I suppose it could have been a bit gorier, but they actually worked really well within the restrictions they had, opting to use things like match cuts or some really imaginative visuals. Like this scene here, where they use the fact that Mike is dreaming to show him getting attacked by the animatronics without actually having to show anything too gory. And personally, I think this is a more interesting way of doing things that only occasionally comes off as goofy.
Was that the bite of 87?
Instead, I think the problem is more that the movie seems scared to let the tension sit. It felt like anytime things started to get a little bit creepy, they'd immediately undercut it with another attempt at comedy that just never really hit for me.
Why do I always get the weirdos?
And I think this is because, despite covering some pretty heavy topics, the FNAF franchise has always been very popular with kids. Which, just to be clear, is fine, and I do see this movie potentially being a good jumping on point for new horror fans. Kind of like how Scream was for me, which, incidentally, also stars Matthew Illard. However, this approach can be at odds with the times they pivot to try and appeal more directly to fans like me who are in their 20s. So while I was engaged during the more grounded front half, I could also see some younger viewers getting bored and tuning out, but then the back half has almost the exact opposite problem. I think if they want to improve things for the sequel, they're either going to need to strike up a better balance between these two tones, or pick one and stick with it. But to wrap things up, despite all my gripes, speaking as a FNAF fan, I still had a great time here. I just don't necessarily think I can recommend it as a straight horror film. But they've built a solid foundation, and I am excited to see where the franchise goes from here. So, while it might not be as good as the Banana Splits, I'd still place it above Willy's Wonderland. C+. I still have no idea how to organically end these.